corruption in boxing here. It's been a while. To be honest, I've been a little bit disillusioned with boxing the last few months. Too many fights are now becoming very difficult to make, whether it's a fighter signing with a different broadcast network, or fighters are becoming content, as in the case of Leo Santa Cruz, who is a very talented fighter. If you watch him carefully, he's one of the most defensively conscious fighters. His chin is tucked in, literally to the nipples on his chest. Hence, only the hardest part of his body is exposed, i.e. his skull. Whenever he throws a jab or a right hand, he's always fundamentally sound in terms of he will bring his right hand back to protect the side of his jaw, to negate any possible left hooks. He's got punch output, he's got the ability to go to the body, combination punching, he's got everything. Physically, we know he has the height at 126, but he came from great poverty. He talked about how his brothers were the breadline of the family, and both of them tried to make it as prize fighters, but they weren't good enough, or I think one of them suffered an injury, so they were surviving on food scraps. And fortunately for the family, Leo had the ability, made the right connections, and we know the rest is history. He's a freeweight world champion. Golden Boy signed him originally, but then he subsequently moved to Al Heyman. It's interesting because Al Heyman, the fight I really wanted to talk about was James DeGale and Chris Eubank Jr. But there is a sort of a connection which gives a bit, sheds a bit of light on both fighters now. Chris Eubank Jr. signed a multi-fight deal and a multi-million-pound deal with Al Heyman's PBC. His fights will be showcased on ITV in the UK, which is one of the biggest television networks, in the world. You can't begrudge a fighter for doing so. It doesn't matter what my opinion or your opinion is on the fighter, whether we think he's good enough. I've spoke about Chris in the past, but as Don King once famously stated, in boxing you don't get what you deserve, you get what you can negotiate. So I would rather be in Chris's position than in mine. So it's fantastic news for him. But Al Heyman, when he was proposing the deal to Chris's father, English as he's known in the United Kingdom, Al Heyman relayed to Senior that Heyman's brother was a struggling boxer, I think back in the 70s. He was paid, his services were undervalued. I think he was paid very subsistent, derisory sums of money, contractual problems as well. So what a Heyman was trying to emphasize to Senior was that Heyman, he's all about trying to work with a fighter as opposed to trying to overcomplicate the matter, trying to not pay a fighter correctly, late payments, as we've heard with a lot of promoters. almost an empathetic kind of situation, that he understands the struggles of a fighter, and therefore his modus operandi is to make sure that a fighter is well paid. You know, that's absolutely fair enough. You know, fighters are, the first pound or the first dollar or the first euro should always fall, you know, to the fighter. So Chris now has the backing of the PBC. He's involved now in it's a major fight, and it's really put a lot of pressure on him in his bout with James DeGale, which is taking place this evening at the O2 Arena in London. A fantastic venue. You know, whenever I'm in the United Kingdom, when I'm coming back from the Netherlands, you know, I've seen many a fight at the O2 Arena. So many functions there, you know, DJs performing there, etc. So it's one of the best sort of 20,000 capacity arenas, you know, in the UK. James is from Harlesden, London. Chris is actually from Sussex, Brighton. So James, you know, really should have the majority of the support. But it's a fight that both of these fighters have discussed the possibility of for many years. There's always been a great deal of animosity between both fighters. Even after when James had won the gold medal and he'd signed with Frank Warren on the same day as Frankie Gavin and Billy Joe Saunders. All three of them signed simultaneously, and they all made their professional debuts on the same card. So there's always been, whether it's jealousy or just some sort of bitterness between the two. So that's now coming to fruition. James DeGale, who vacated his IBF belt after re-winning it against Caleb Truax in quite an ugly fight, but at least he showed more heart and desire than in the first fight, where his performance was absolutely shocking. A fighter who exemplified no confidence. Strategically, his tactics were very wrong. He was choosing to languish on the ropes, where he was trying to take the sting out of Truax's punches, trying to counter him on up against the ropes, which DeGale doesn't really have. That's not really his forte. That's not his boxing. That's not his DNA in what got him success in the amateurs, and when he won the IBF belt against Andre Durrell in the United States. Maybe it was the remnants of some of the beatings he had taken in his previous fights. You know, I spoke often about his fight with Badou Jack, which was still one of the best fights in a number of years. James showed good ability at spots in that fight, particularly in the first round, where he dropped Badou with a scintillating right hand, almost shot from the hips. But Badou Jack's defensive prowess, his indomitable sort of work rate, high output, his imperious body attack. You know, James DeGale sustained a hell of a lot of damage. We saw the facial damage at the end of the fight. You know, James's tooth was knocked out, but James claims that it was a bridge. You know, James used to work as a plumber and claims that the tooth was knocked out whilst he was working back then. I'm not sure, but the facial damage was very severe. He required surgery subsequently. I think he also needed shoulder surgery. So there was a little bit of talk whether he'd come back to the first Caleb Truax fight, which was promoted by Frank Warren. Fight that was shown on Box Nation, I believe. You know, close friends of James talked about how he made a return to the ring a little bit too prematurely. He didn't allow his shoulder to recover. That's possible. But in this fight, Jimmy McDonald, his trainer, and Paulie Malignaggi, who is his chief second, which is quite surprising, both of them have talked about how James's niggling injuries would just become an irritation for a number of fights. How his training camp has not been disrupted by any sort of niggling injuries or problems. They've had good momentum. James has been able to utilize his body to the full extent, his upper body, in terms of trying out new combinations with his right hand, you know, right hooks, right hands to the body. But we've heard that before. You know, boxing fans are not naive to pay-per-view fights being the hype behind them being accentuated, you know, to sell pay-per-views, to sell tickets. So, but the training footage is always an indication of how a fighter is looking, and I've had a look at James, and he physically, he definitely seems that he's able to contest it, you know, a 12-round fight, a competitive 12-round fight. I couldn't see any problems with James being a little bit too conservative in hitting the heavy bag, or when he was hitting the pads with Jimmy. So that's a good sign. You know, let's hope for a competitive 12-round fight. Now, Chris Eubank Jr. now, he's taken on a trainer for, I'm not sure whether it's that we've known his work with Adam Booth and a number of other cats in the past, but he met Nate Vasquez, quite a low-profile trainer, at the Floyd Mayweather gym in Vegas. Chris mentioned that Nate has been residing at his property, so they've had very good momentum. They've spent a great deal of time together, you know, no distractions, you know, trying to maximize time. So maybe the penny has dropped. Chris, extremely arrogant, you know, he tends to wrap his own hands, very autonomous in his mindset, in his training camp. Whether it's a delusional level of arrogance, but in any case, the two defeats he's suffered, he realizes now that it's make or break given his new deal he's got. And we've seen Chris Sr. as well become almost apologetic for some of the bold predictions he's made in the past, that Junior would emulate Floyd Mayweather and that he would beat Gennady Golovkin. You know, some of the most ridiculous predictions, but that is what, you know, that's a father, you know, a father and son relationship, you know, that fathers are going to prop up the expectations of their offspring. Customoto always used to say, you know, it's all about confidence, instilling that confidence in the fighter. You know, Mike Tyson often said he didn't know why Customoto was claiming that Mike would be the, you know, the greatest ever, but he realised it's all about building up a fighter's confidence. So he goes in that mentality in the ring where he doesn't fear his opponents. He's been told that he has the ability to go in there and knock him out, outbox him, etc. So it is an important step. You've only got to look at Adrian Broner, the dichotomy in his character. He talks a hell of a game outside the ring, but the body language doesn't lie inside the ring. He's a fighter who fights with no confidence whatsoever. He now fights behind, flat-footed behind a high guard because he's so afraid of being knocked out. You know, that is a fighter with no confidence. So now this fight, you know, James DeGale has been a career-long 168-pound super middleweight fighter. Junior is coming up from 160 pounds. He's been at 168 for 3 fights now. Reynold Quinlan was the first when he won the IBO. Then he fought Abney Yildirim, who's fighting for the WBC belt in the early hours. He knocked him out. I think that's still his best performance. Fighting in, I think it was in Stuttgart, Germany. Abney Yildirim was even putting him on the back foot. Chris, I think, floored him initially with an uppercut, and then a fearsome exchange in the 3rd round resulted in Chris opening up and teeing off with a, you have to say, a well-timed, accurate, powerful left hook, which took out Avni, quite a stocky sort of super middleweight. So he definitely showed good promise there. But in the George Groves fight, where he was the bookies' favourite, certain boxing channels have talked about how Chris Eubank may have frozen in that particular fight, but I don't subscribe to that theory. A fighter freezing is not testament to him not showing up in the first half of the fight. You've got to look at his performances in a lot of the fights. Now, Chris has always been criticised as a fighter who doesn't have good fundamentals. His technique is very bad as well. And if you look at the George Groves fight, he was trying to tee off with very flamboyant hooks from long range, which clearly weren't going to hit the target, up against quite an astute fighter in George Groves who just changed levels. So he doesn't fight upright, he's actually crowding down, and he's coming up with that up jab. So for Chris to try and tee off with hooks without trying to set up his punches, I thought was crazy tactics. Yeah, he realised he was getting outboxed, so maybe his options was to try and knock out George Groves, so fair enough. But George is a wily old campaigner. You're not gonna connect with anything. You're not gonna set him up. He's no gimme. You got to show a little bit more subtlety, a little bit more multi-dimension. You know, Chris does actually have a good jab, but he didn't use it correctly, and he was underutilized as well. So the performance was just terrible from start to finish. At no point did he actually gain momentum in the fight. He was comprehensively being outboxed. But this is the key. Now, Chris Eubank Jr. has 2 defeats to two fighters. The first one being Billy Joe Saunders, and the second one being George Groves. Now, what is the common denominator with those fighters? Both George and Billy Joe have fantastic world-class jabs, and that is how both of them won that fight. George Groves controlled distance with that jab, and Billy Joe Saunders, we know, is a great front runner. He utilised the jab beautifully. It's quite a hard jab, and he's got a very hard right hook as well. But you can use the jab as a counter punch. We saw that in that fight, and we saw it in the David Lemieux fight as well. And that's the key. If you have a fantastic jab, then you've got a great opportunity of beating Chris Eubank Jr. Now, what is the one weapon that James DeGale absolutely does not possess in his arsenal? Or according to statistics, he utilizes that weapon hardly ever. You know, sometimes 3, 4, under 10 times in the entire fight, and that is a jab. You know, DeGale has absolutely no jab whatsoever. So it's going to be very difficult for James to keep Chris Eubank, who's going to be coming forward in this fight. I think Chris is going to be hunting him down. Chris feels that he's the fresher, younger fighter. So James is going to have to be moving in this fight. If he's languishing on the ropes, if he makes the same mistake in previous fights, then that will be to his detriment, I think. James is definitely, we know from his amateur pedigree that he's the more accomplished fighter, both technically and fundamentally. James, we know, is a former Olympic gold medalist, so a highly decorated amateur. Two-time super middleweight champion, beaten Andre Durrell, went to Canada to beat Lucien Butte, struggled in the Rogelio Medina, a guy had been knocked out by Yuri Boy Campo like 10 years before that, so for James to be struggling with Medina was, you know, that was surprising to me. Badujak was adjudicated the draw, but James definitely had the fight beat out of him in that. Whereas Junior doesn't really have any major signature wins. You know, he's beaten a veteran, Arthur Abraham, in the United Kingdom, and Abraham 5 years before that would have probably knocked out Junior, who does have a good chin, so maybe a points victory, or but Abraham these days, you know, chooses to, for 2 minutes of the fight, he's behind a high guard, and he only opens up in the last minute of the round. But Abraham had a granite chin in the past, you know, was a little bit more active, a little bit more mobile in the past, so when Chris fought him, maybe it was a major payday for Arthur. But it's a notable body on his resume, you know, a former world champion. So Reynold Quinlan, he was the IBO champion, but Reynold Hasn't really done much before that or even after that. I think he's recently been beaten again, so... Anthony Yildirim, I guess, is probably the best person on his resume, and we'll see how good Anthony Yildirim is when he challenges Anthony DeGale for the WBC title. But Anthony Yildirim was a little bit stationary, just coming forward, very little upper body movement, pretty much a heavy bag on wheels. Chris was able to measure him up, able to tee off, cycle through different combinations. Chris's uppercut in that fight was very good. But DeGale tends to use far more. He uses the ring far more, and I think he's got a. James may have indicated that he wanted a bigger ring in this fight, and I believe his wishes have been granted. So that indicates what his strategy may be. Try and distance control. But how is he going to achieve that without a jab? It's going to be difficult. James is going to probably be trying a pot shot from sort of distance. I think James is definitely going to be clinching in this fight. Whether he has the physical strength to keep Junior off him, I'm not sure. Chris does look like a, we know he's a shredded athlete. So I presume that there's a great deal of strength there as well. So James is going to be negating. Chris is going to have to try and come mid-range, short range. Chris really doesn't have any boxing ability at long range. So if James is unable to keep him off with a jab, and he doesn't really have the punching power, it's going to be a very difficult night's work for James. His conditioning is going to have to be tip-top, because Chris Eubank can go 12 rounds. How good Chris's chin is, well, not really sure, because George Groves definitely floored him in their fight. 2 knockdowns, which were both ruled as they weren't ruled as knockdowns, so the referee clearly made 2 mistakes in that fight. But they were definitely knockdowns. They were sharp counters from George. It wasn't the case of the feet getting tangled or the canvas being slippery. So Chris can definitely be hurt. George did always carry a bit of power. He did floor Carl Froch as well in the first round, hurt him badly. So George had a fantastic sort of looping right hand. DeGale, not really a knockout puncher. He did floor Andre Durrell, and it was a beautiful, left hand that floored him. DeGale is very good generally for the first 6 rounds, but then whether it's due to stamina, conditioning, or some sort of mental block, he tends to go into some sort of cruise mode. He seems to think that he's banked enough rounds for him to take a number of rounds off. Quite a stupid tactic in my opinion. So fighters always tend to come back in the in the second half of the fight. And we've seen some close decisions as well, so I don't think James can do that in this fight. When Chris Eubank fought Billy Joe Saunders, the only reason why Chris came back in the second half of the fight was due to Billy Joe Saunders fatiguing. It had nothing to do with him freezing. Billy Joe's, we know Billy Joe doesn't live the life of a fighter. He balloons up in weight. He just doesn't enjoy boxing. He doesn't enjoy the training aspect. And Billy Joe notoriously does gas in the second half of the fight. So that allowed Eubank to come back into the fight. So that may have made the fight a little bit closer, but Chris was still getting beaten comprehensively by Billy Joe, who really is a very good counter puncher when his mind is on it. But sadly, activities outside the ring have now pretty much destroyed his career inside the boxing ring. It's shocking that Billy Joe is not even prepared to fight for his 160-pound belt against Demetrius Andrade, when I was one of the major proponents that there was no validity to any of the drugs allegations. I had looked at that situation in depth. The sanctioning bodies made him the mandatory challenger, but Billy Joe is elected to fight for a 168-pound vacant title. Given that he was mandatory for the WBA, I think Frank Warren was able to petition with the WBO to obtain a title opportunity for Saunders to fight for a vacant belt against a nondescript opponent. So that's very disappointing from Saunders. But in any case, let's get back to this fight. I think we're going to see a very good James DeGale, but I think he's the sustained punishment he's taken throughout his career. I think the major fact that he lacks a very good jab, I think that's going to be a fundamental omission in this fight. Fighters, as I've already articulated, the two fighters who've had world-class jabs, that's been their primary reason as to why they've beaten Junior. So it's going to be very difficult for James to maintain distance in this fight. I think Chris is going to be able to walk him down. I think James is going to be unable to clinch Chris, smother his works for sustained periods. I think he's probably going to end up getting warnings. He may even get a point deducted for holding. I think Chris is just going to be a little bit too strong for him inside the pocket. And Chris is going to fire off his wild, extravagant combinations. I can probably see James DeGale even languishing on the back foot in this fight, getting trapped up against the ropes. So I'm tentatively going with Chris Eubank Jr. in this fight. Whether he has the power to stop James DeGale, he's not heavy-handed. He wasn't at 160 pounds. I've seen no indication, apart from the Avni Yildirim knockout at 168 pounds. Although George Groves did indicate that he does have a bit of power, he puts everything in his punches. That's why he just over-oscillates and just falls over, stumbles over, because he's just, teeing off with the kitchen sink, as they say. I don't think DeGale has got the reflexes either. The Caleb Truax showed to me that he was unable to slip and slide the punches His defense wasn't there at all. DeGale's defense is generally his legs, and so my final prediction, I'm going with Chris Eubank Jr. Maybe it's a majority or unanimous points decision. It may well even be a stoppage later on, but I'm not sure. But Chris Eubank Jr., he'll probably reclaim his IBO belt, the belt that George Groves felt was an embarrassment, refused to pay the sanctioning fees. So Chris now, maybe he'll be the 2-time IBO champion of the world. Yeah, not much more to say on that fight. Yeah, it's a bit of an extended breakdown. Let me know how you guys think the fight will go. There's only a few more hours, I think. Who you got for this fight? DeGale, Eubank? Can DeGale pull it out of the bank one last time? Or is this fight a nail on this coffin? One major payday, pay-per-view fight. Showtime are picking up the fight in the United States, so both of them getting paid, a handsome ransom in this fight. So yeah, let me know how you guys think the fight's gonna go. Yeah, corruption in boxing. Sayonara.